I'm just going to give an overview of what I'm going to talk about today, which is a little bit to help define some terms. Austin actually just talked about this a little bit ago. It's pretty important from where I stand to have some clear definitions of what we are talking about when we talk about finances and economics in this new industry. And so I'm going to do a little bit of work to help provide some definition. And it's the kind of definition you need when you are drilling down into details. It is not the kind of definition that anybody needs to be really a stickler about. If you're talking to someone else and they interchange these terms, but everybody knows what everybody's talking about, it's totally fine. I'm not trying to like bring the hammer down on anyone, but I'm just trying to help make some distinctions to help people see how, as an economist, I think about these markets. So first, I'm going to do a little work to make some of those definitions very briefly. Then I'm going to talk about some of the work we've done with this project I mentioned here in Massachusetts to look at the financial model of farm agricultural production, particularly with respect to agricultural revenues and costs. And then I'm going to give you some examples of some of the economic aspects of this market, either some research that's been done or just some questions that could be asked, mostly just to provide a contrast. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to make some definitions here on some distinctions between financial and economic modeling. When I think about a financial model as an economist, I'm thinking about a firm level financial analysis, right? As a business, what are the things that you think about at the business level when you're making decisions? The biggest kinds of questions that you have when you're entering a new market or you're starting a new aspect of your business is really just about viability, right? Is this project going to be financially viable? But you also want to think about what the constraints are at your level, like things you can control. And you also want to think about what you're trading off to participate in this new potential project. Now, as an economist, I just want to point out that in this project and in the concept of agrivoltaics, we're talking about a farm operating as a firm, right? A farm is a business. But this word firm can be replaced. It can be replaced with a household level decision-making, individual consumer level decision-making, really any other sort of individual unit. So just in terms of definitions, a financial model is looking at one specific entity, an individual level entity, and thinking about how you're balancing your choices at that level. By contrast, an economic model is looking at the aggregate, right? Looking at the market level. So in the aggregate, all the firms, all the consumers, all the farms, all the households, once you start to aggregate all those things, how do those interactions start to allocate scarce resources? That's when you start thinking about this aggregate level, is when you're starting to think about economic analysis. At that point, we're thinking about market level constraints. We're thinking about trade-offs at the market level. And then we're also trying to think about how this, whatever we're trying to model impacts society as a whole. And just to be specific, I am a microeconomist. There are sort of other ways to interpret this if you're a macroeconomist, but for my discipline, I'm focused on microeconomics. Okay, so with those two things very basically defined, when we're thinking about agrivoltaics at the farm financial level, so financial models of firm decision-making in agrivoltaics at the farm level, the things that we want to think about are the revenues from agricultural production versus the costs from agricultural production, how those things change when you have an installation. And then, of course, the revenues from the energy production compared to the costs from the energy production when you make those changes. So what we're going to be asking is how revenues and costs associated with producing a crop under agrivoltaic installations change compared to a farm with no agrivoltaic installations. Now, in a lot of the conceptualization around agrivoltaics are compared to utility scale arrays that don't have any sort of other production going on underneath them. And so this is a a framework that we're choosing here, but I think it's the relevant framework for a farm, for a farmer who already has land and they're trying to make a decision. So that's why we're approaching it that way. Now, I'll also say that the revenues and the costs from energy production. Oh, I can see I have a busted bullet down there. Make that last agricultural energy. Sorry about that. The revenues and costs from energy production are things that Jake and NREL have done a lot of work on. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to build out the changes in agricultural production costs and revenues in a way that we could try to feed into models that already are taking into account the energy aspect of a agrivoltaics operation. So we narrowed our focus in this conversation that we're gonna embark on. Okay, so what we did is we chose 4 agricultural products that are common in Massachusetts, which I recognize might be different than in Colorado. There are a lot of differences here we can talk about. We chose lettuce, butternut squash, cranberries. So cranberries are perennial crop. You might think of them as sort of similar to like a high bush blueberry. It's not exactly the same, but in terms of like the way a farm operation would have to think about that. It's a perennial, so it's a plant that lives for 20 to 30 years, hopefully. And we did some deep dives with folks that are extension agents, horticulturists, soil scientists, and farmers to think really deeply about what they do on their farm and how solar arrays might change what they do on their farm. And we did something called a whole farm budget approach. Now, a lot of times when people are talking about doing some kind of new practice on their farm, they really just think about one small aspect of their farm that they're going to change. They don't think about the whole farm, right? Say you're going to try to do some sort of new tillage method. You think about the changes to the tillage aspect of your operation. You don't think about the changes necessarily to the bigger aspect of your operation. But agrivoltaics are a really different kind of approach on a farm. And they incorporate a lot of really potentially big changes that farmers have to make, including major capital expenses. And so we wanted to think about this at a different level, the whole farm approach, so we could take all those things into account, specifically when you're thinking about major capital expenses that have to be amortized over 20 or 30 years. So the way that we did this is we developed an on-farm logbook to look at the day-to-day differences in how people might approach production. We looked at the whole farm book, how the bigger sort of higher cost changes might affect the whole farm, amortized over time. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to have this kind of big picture, this big hopper, where we took all this data and it could filter down into just one number that could be plugged in to the NREL Inspire financial calculator that could show the net return per acre, how it changed under agrivoltaic installations. Obviously, lots of data, lots of assumption. Now, we did this with an old version of the NREL calculator, so we're probably going to have to fiddle with it a little because there's a relatively newer version that I think James and maybe even Jake are going to talk about. So we did all this work. We developed these tools in this model. We submitted them to a journal. It's been accepted for publication. Hopefully it'll come out soon, and then it'll be publicly available to everybody. There's some worksheets and things. Here's a quick overview of the on-farm logbook. It's really complicated. I'm not going to show you all the input pages, but this is one of the pages where things start to boil down. And in this page, we're looking at inputs and supplies that are not labor related. A major change in this kind of environment is labor-related change, and labor is one of the highest on-farm costs. So it's something you can't ignore, but it's very hard to estimate until prior to having done this kind of installation. So it's something you have to really think through. And then here's an example of the whole farm book. This is another page where data are aggregated from lots of different places. You can see we're starting to, I don't know if you can see, hopefully you can see, we're starting to come up with some net revenues per acre, this yellow section. That's the section that we think can be fed into some other models that include the energy production side of things. So what we're trying to show here is when you have an acre of land, let's say, obviously it'll be bigger than that, but let's just say for illustration purposes, you have an acre of land. You don't have you don't have solar production on that land. How much does it cost you per acre? What's the net revenue you get per acre from farming on that land for whatever you're producing? How does that change under a solar array? That's what we're looking at. And so that is the thing that can get fed into another model where you can compare your revenue and costs from energy production and see what the balance looks like. Okay, so this is a financial model. I'm just going to quickly show you how we try to go from the activity level to the labor involved and how the activities change, coming up with some small aggregation there, plugging it into this whole farm tool, looking at all the other revenues you get from your farm, all the other acres in yield, all the other costs. And then and the key part of this that I didn't talk about is measuring changes in your actual yield, right? How does the array change the yield? I think in a temperate environment like in Massachusetts, it may actually, it looks like it's decreasing our yield and the quality to a certain extent, although we had a very wet year, so it's hard to say for sure. It may be that in arid and semi-arid places, it's actually increasing production because it's reducing moisture, reducing evaporation, which is great, right? If you already are water constrained. And then we sort of aggregate all the revenues, all the fixed costs, all the variable costs, get our summary data. We come to one or two measures that we can plug into models that include the energy production side. That's the point here. All right, so this is a big project. If at the end we have time and anybody wants to see these actual spreadsheets as opposed to a picture of a spreadsheet, I have them. We can open them up and take them for a spin. And as I said, they should be available soon. Okay, so if you're a farmer and you are sort of thinking about whether this is a good choice for your operation, here are some things that I think we're discovering are really important to consider. First of all, are you going to try to do this self-op? Or are you going to work with a developer? And if you're going to work with a developer, what are your contract terms? And how do you know that those are good terms? Right? There's a lot of proprietary information in this field, especially because it's a new field. And so it's very hard to know whether your terms are good terms or maybe less than good terms. I think that we are lucky in Massachusetts to have some longstanding community members that have a track record of being good stewards. And so that is a little easier for us, but I'm not sure that's always the case everywhere else. But you guys could correct me if I'm wrong with that. You have to think of these large ancillary investments. We have a farmer in our project who is haying under the arrays, and the tractor that he had before it wasn't going to fit. It was going to be kind of scary. So he had to go and buy a smaller tractor. And he did that, but that's not a small investment. That's a big deal. So that's the kind of thing you have to start thinking about. Do you have to change your irrigation systems? If you have posts and you have some kind of spray irrigation, you're going to have some trouble. If you have a bar irrigator, you're going to have some trouble. You have to think that stuff through. Human behavior is a really big deal. People think it's not going to change the way they farm, but what we're seeing is that it really changes the way people farm. So they make different choices than they used to make, and that impacts a lot. So that's something that I think we all need to think about a little more. I think we have to think more about future trade-offs with climate change impacts. I won't get that much into detail about that in Massachusetts. I think that we are facing increased moisture pressure, and that's potentially not great for an agrivoltaic array. And then you also have to think about the time horizon, right? What's going to happen if you have a 30-year time horizon, but you are not going to stay farming for the next 30 years? How does an array like that impact your succession planning? If you think that you're going to sell your land so that you can retire, that's going to be much harder if you have an array like that potentially. So these are things you have to sort of consider. Okay, quickly, I'm going to talk about economic models, some recent literature. Utility scale solar installations decrease property values in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And that's something we just have to acknowledge is real. Not saying it is how it should be, but that's the way it is right now. So that's something to think about. It seems to be due to a loss of amenity in terms of open space and a gain of disamenity in terms of something that people perceive as something they don't want to see. In Rhode Island, there is a really great economic study that found that residents are more likely to opt out of supporting utility scale solar if it's an agrivoltaic installation compared to like a brownfield or a parking lot or some kind of commercial siting. And then another really interesting thing coming up is that if you have utility scale solar on farmland, it increases the value of proximate farmland, which puts land pressure on agricultural production. So it may be that the issue is not the farm choice and any sort of impact on agricultural production under the array just on the farm, but it's because the land that used to be agricultural land is worth more. And so there's more pressure to sell the land. So that's actually something that is more of an economic question than a farm financial question that I think warrants a little more additional research. Okay, so here's some other examples of economic research, things that look at this big picture. What's the impact of agrivoltaics on the aggregate supply of food? I think we all know that that's a question we need to look at. We're doing that with this project. What's the impact of agrivoltaics on the net acreage of farmland, on farm viability, and on the value and use of proximate resources? So to test these kind of questions from an economic point of view, we're looking for causality, right? We're not looking for surveys that show correlation. We're looking for causality. We need large data sets. We use economic theory, and we use econometric models. You can think of like regressions. And that's how we approach these sort of bigger picture market level analyses. So that's different. Obviously, the farm financial piece is important. It has the potential to be quite relevant when you aggregate it up over scale. But ultimately, what we're looking at is this sort of net impact. Okay, that's it. I don't know if I went over or not. I tried not to.
You did great, Jill. Thank you so much. If you don't mind stopping to share your screen, and then I'll transition over to Mr. James McCall from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. You may share your screen.
I'm trying, but it's very glitchy. Hold on a second. Give me a second. There we go.
No worries. I have the same problem.
There we go.
Okay. Well, thanks, everyone. Yes, thank you for the introduction, Austin. Panelists, if because I was really late logging on, if my sound is bad, please interrupt me. But so yeah, so very happy to be here and kind of talk about some of the more of the PV kind of system kind of impacts on the techno-economic modeling. I think that's going to really complement what Dr. Fitzsimmons talked about. So a lot of this data and a lot of this modeling has kind of come about through the INSPIRE project, or Innovative Solar Practices Integrated with Rural Ecosystem Economies and Ecosystems, which is, we are currently in year 8.5 out of a 9-year research project, with some more to come, funded by the Department of Energy Solar Energy Technology Office. And it's really trying to couple field-based research. So we have kind of, agrivoltaic sites, 24 sites throughout the country. That is a mix of pollinator habitat, grazing, and crop production. And then kind of coupling that with kind of more of these models, and much more kind of relevant to this, which is kind of cost-benefit trade-offs of different agrivoltaic configurations, tracking some of the projects throughout the country, and also kind of assessing these kind of research gaps and priorities. Map on the top left is basically, kind of capturing some of the geographic diversity that we have represented, and then a lot of our project partners below, which is the mix of industry members, universities, nonprofits, and other kind of entities in this space. So a lot of this kind of goes into the steps of, how do you actually model a renewable energy system, basically in the ecosystem of the NREL tools. And it's really about kind of coupling the weather data, your system specs, the system losses to get your energy production, which is then offset by costs. You have different compensation mechanisms, how you're going to finance these projects, and kind of incentives. And that really kind of gets towards these like overarching kind of economic metrics that are very specific to kind of projects. And so agrivoltaics designs really affect a lot of these different areas, such as system specs, electricity production, the costs, the compensation for what you're actually getting for your electricity. It could potentially impact financing, but I think I'm going to let Jake talk a lot more about that, and also kind of incentives. So really kind of what we have really seen is that, system specifications, this really impacts kind of the spacing of the modules. Like, do you actually have to space the panels out further to allow more light in? The height of the panels, which is actually going to affect the cost fairly drastically, that we can talk about later, or the system configuration. If you have to change something away from the standard practice, that generally comes at a cost, but it then allows you to kind of do a different agrivoltaic, system. So these are all things that kind of need to be balanced. We're also seeing some impacts on electricity generation, both from maybe you can't get as much solar on that same acre of land, but also, in particularly in certain areas and kind of in the arid desert Southwest, we are seeing a small increase in generation from the microclimate differences under the modules. We're also seeing kind of the electricity sale price. Are you selling as a PPA to a utility, or are you participating, kind of like in Jack Solar Gardens case, in a community solar market? These are then going to have kind of different revenue streams that then can offset your costs and actually have a fairly large impact on your overall economics. You have differences in cost. You might have to have a little more land. Generally, you don't have water access on most solar sites. So do you have to drill a well? Are these different farming / grazing practices, as Dr. Fitzsimmons mentioned, going to impact or kind of lead to increased costs and equipment buying, and then so on and so forth. And then finally, kind of some potential benefits. Do farming revenues then balance the increased costs, or is there any increased crop yield, or is there increased generation? So can we kind of come and kind of try to assess but how all these different pieces kind of tie together. So in like a lot of this presentation, I'll go over some of the modeling efforts, kind of the scale of the modeling, and then try to provide a few examples. As people who have used the system advisor model before, basically this is really good at getting at kind of these PV-centric kind of metrics. So levelized cost of energy, annual generation, a lot of financing metrics. But if you've ever kind of been in there, there's really no spot to put farming revenue. There's no spot to kind of put changes in the microclimate. And so I'd be happy to kind of go through in further detail later, kind of like how we kind of can trick the model into kind of doing some of this. But this is kind of the flagship tool that we use for a lot of our economic model. And then this actually ties into, and Dr. Fitzsimmons, thank you so much for introducing that. I'm also super excited to see that someone's using it. So you just kind of made my day right there. But basically, this is like a really good, very quick screening kind of tool just to kind of introduce the concept. It's a very kind of like simplified version of a lot of the metrics that would actually go into the system advisor model. But it's kind of like a way for, I don't know much about agrivoltaics, and this is kind of a way to kind of sit down and introduce the topic, knowing that a lot of these numbers need a lot more inputs. So it's like wanted to kind of highlight that there's basically the NREL Inspire Agrivoltaic Financial Calculator. There's the System Advisor model, and then we have kind of a Python version of the System Advisor model, and that's kind of basically simpler to kind of more complex modeling efforts. And I'll kind of present some of the things from there. So as I mentioned before, one of the largest kind of drivers of the economics for agrivoltaics is basically the cost of development. And so basically this is from a paper that was published in 2020. There'll be a link, and we will be sharing the slides, I believe, about different kind of PV systems and their kind of like impact on cost. And as you can see from this PV and grazing system, which is roughly a traditional utility scale solar system, up to this kind of reinforced regular mount, which is kind of high in the air, kind of reinforced mounting, there is a roughly 70 cents per watt kind of cost increase, which is roughly a 30 to 35% increase in cost, mainly due to the structural and electrical balance of system. I will put a caveat here that I know, well, NREL knows that these numbers are wrong, but we think that kind of the impact and kind of the percentage difference is actually going to be kind of fairly accurate, or at least kind of from our initial modeling perspective. We're in the process of updating this to try to get much more recent numbers to kind of represent some more industry's trends. But so far, this is kind of at least kind of a very quick way to start kind of screening some of these systems and kind of have that like initial cost number. We're also seeing some changes in operations and maintenance costs. So kind of these are basically a paper that was published taking a look at different operations and maintenance costs for different ground covers, such as native vegetation or pollinator habitat, sheep grazing, turf grass, and gravel. And basically for the most part, what we're seeing is that there are not a lot of differences in kind of the average cost between these different O&M practices. There is a lot more range for different practices, but basically showing that, if you can find, someone to work with, these are all viable options for kind of managing costs. I think the only one that was slightly higher was basically kind of doing gravel based, but that's based on a small kind of sample size. So that's just kind of some of the resources that we have for the inputs that go into the financial modeling. And now I want to kind of go over kind of like what we're seeing on these kind of trade-offs of different systems. So on the left of this slide is basically kind of a much more energy focused kind of model. And on the right is a farmer focused model. So basically the further that you go right, the more that we change the PV design to accommodate farming practices, such as lifting the panels, spacing the panels further apart, such as some sites in Massachusetts where you actually remove every other panel to kind of actually allow some light through, because again, it is more of a sunlight limited system than in the desert Southwest. Or as we're starting to see a lot more in Europe and kind of some test sites, kind of vertical bifacial, kind of wide spacing, kind of like allowing a lot of land to still be in like agricultural production, while generally in some PV, but generally less. And so kind of using SAM, you can actually go through and take a look at each of these different things, such as the total install cost for, and this is basically for a system designed over 1 acre. You can see the annual generation and that impact. So you can see the net present value of these different systems and then kind of the simple payback period. And so it's just kind of like a way to kind of start kind of using this as like a screening method to kind of get there. But then this is also coupled with farmable area. So how much farming can you still do? And sunlight quality. All of this outside of basically the farmable area kind of was actually an output from the system advisor model. This is more just kind of a geometric kind of taking a look at like how much farming was still available. But basically just kind of a highlighting in that how do we use SAM as a way to kind of screen different methods, and basically as a way to kind of do that. So that's kind of the system advisor model piece. From the project's perspective, but kind of how about much more of a kind of a sensitivity analysis of like, what if we only change one of these metrics? So what we wanted to do was we wanted to modulate the row spacing of like a traditional utility scale solar site and see kind of what is that impact on the PPA price needed to kind of offset that kind of increase. So basically I am spacing my panels further apart. I need to purchase a little more land. And then I'm going to have some agricultural practices. And so it's basically seeing kind of like what actually has an impact on the PPA or power purchase agreement price, which is basically what the developer or the owner of the PV system is actually going to get in basically how they sell their kind of electricity. And so we wanted to look at kind of, again, for Colorado, or basically similar to the previous presentation, for Colorado specific things. And we wanted to integrate kind of what machinery was actually needed to do onions, sugar beets, potatoes, and winter wheat. And so it turns out that basically, for the most part, for onions and potatoes, there is, you don't really need to do much difference to the current kind of PV design. And so we're seeing kind of the economics are really driven by energy prices. So on the bottom is really this crop profit per acre. And so it's kind of modulating kind of throughout that. Basically, it has like little impact, but not much. But then as we start spacing the panels out further, such as for sugar beets, which you actually almost have to double, you're seeing that kind of like break-even line kind of change and actually kind of modulate. And then finally for winter wheat, we actually have to space much further apart, such as 60, 70 feet to kind of get the combine through there. Your break-even PPA price is basically changing throughout that. So this is just kind of highlighting kind of this, at least initial framework on how we start kind of balancing PV revenue with farming revenue. And so we are in the process of publishing this. Still needs a little bit of work, but I think should be coming out soon. Basically about that. But kind of what we see then is these different kind of break-even PPA prices, and basically the different colors are different row spacing. So the more row spacing that you have, the more the crop profit actually has an impact, and that makes sense because now you're deprioritizing electricity production and instead kind of looking more at kind of farming production. So that's just kind of some initial kind of economic kind of modeling that we've been doing. All of this is, I think, either posted on our Inspire website, which I will share a link to. But a lot of this is also kind of captured in kind of one of the 5 C's of agrivoltaics, or I also call it the 6 years of happy accidents, in terms of like basically how did we learn and kind of what did we change throughout kind of the first 6 years of research, and basically how real world field experience kind of goes into this. And this is kind of a really good report to kind of like look through for a lot of the insights gained from that. So I hope that was useful. That was kind of at least kind of some of that perspective. But now I think I'm going to hand it off to Jake to do a little more kind of analysis on that. But the Inspire website is right here. Would love to kind of chat more about that further.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jake or James. And yeah, Jake, if you don't mind sharing your screen, I'll let you take over.
Minimize that. Okay. Hey, everyone. I'm Jake Marley. I'm the manager of Hyperion Systems. Thank you all for joining the webinar, and thank you, Byron, and the staff at Colorado Agrivoltaic Learning Center for the opportunity to present today. I'll be focusing on the agrivoltaic economic impact through the developer experience or developer lens. I'll start with some company history, some of the past and current research work we've done over the years, and then get into a couple of examples of financial levers that impact agrivoltaic modeling. Included in this are some qualitative considerations regarding agrivoltaics. Hyperion is a solar project developer and research company based in Western Mass. It was founded by my late father in 2010, but his agrivoltaic pursuits started before that in 2008 after he completed his first commercial roof-mounted solar array. He'd become obsessive with the idea of designing an array that wouldn't take agricultural land out of production. His mantra was food first, then energy. He believes we couldn't afford to be sacrificing productive agricultural land, especially in a land-constrained state like Massachusetts, where we have a high population density and most of our food isn't produced here. The image on this slide is of Hyperion's racking design. The project is located in South Deerfield, Massachusetts, on University of Massachusetts Amherst property at the Center for Agricultural Food and Environment, or CAFE. This project has been the recipient of several research awards to study agrivoltaics, first beginning with cattle grazing in 2010 through 2015, then crop trials from 2016 through present day. Broccoli, kale, Swiss chard, and bell peppers have been studied each year, while there have been one-off crop trials like snap beans, tomatoes, and corn. Under Inspire 1.0 from 2016 through 2018, Hyperion was tasked with creating a financial model that compared land use under 3 scenarios. This is a snapshot of the financial tool. This is a cost-benefit summary of the 3 scenarios, the first being ag land or status quo, or excuse me, the first being ag land, yes, no solar. The second being traditional solar install, taking the land out of production for maximum energy generation. And the third scenario, dual use. And the key takeaways from this financial tool was that farmers would financially benefit the most under a dual use scenario, but it would require some form of an incentive to make up for the added cost of array equipment. The levelized cost of energy is higher for agrivoltaics compared to traditional solar, but LCOE doesn't tell the whole picture or provide the whole value, which needs to be priced in. Jill had mentioned that or maybe it was James, with the value of the commodity, the crop underneath. The next slide captures the field research work led by Dr. Stephen Herbert from UMass's Stockbridge School of Agriculture. Stephen's research demonstrated that no reduced yield of more than 30% for any of the crops studied during the 3-year trial. Leafy greens like kale and Swiss chard had a reduction of 11 to 30% in fresh weight, while flowering vegetables like peppers, broccoli, and common bean pods had anywhere from an 8% reduction to a 7% increase in fresh weight. The financial model, along with the field research, led into Massachusetts adopting the agricultural adder within the SMART program in 2018. The current research Hyperion is performing in collaboration with UMass Clean Energy Extension is supported through USDOE's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy under the Solar Energy Technology Office. Jill had talked quite a bit about this work that we're all doing here. The project is also exploring the impacts and implications for economic systems, including on-farm economics, agricultural economies, and public welfare in Massachusetts and nationally. Economic analysis of agrivoltaic adoption will focus on site trial cost and returns, public acceptance, farm adoption of agrivoltaics, and possible effects of agricultural sector. The agronomy areas of focus are those listed on the screen, as well as soil chemical characteristics, soil compaction, health indicators, surface vegetation, and photosynthetically active radiation, or PAR. There are 36 collectors just about in each one of these site trials, 2 areas of control and 2 areas of a variable group. The controls are in full sunlight over the crop, and the variable groups are also over the crop, under partial shading conditions. The data collected will be published in March of 2025, as Jill had mentioned, and anticipated outcomes to contribute to the literature on the impacts of agrivoltaics on agricultural productivity, particularly as applicable to Massachusetts. As a project developer in Massachusetts, we're heavily incentivized to pursue agrivoltaics. The SMART program, which is Massachusetts Solar Incentive Program, includes a 6-cent per kilowatt hour agricultural adder. The project owner's tariff rate consists of a base compensation rate and any applicable adders or subtractors to the project. Massachusetts has a significant adder for projects that meet their requirement for an agricultural solar tariff generating unit, or ASTGU. Projects may apply for the agricultural adder, must go through 2 rounds of application submission and review, first to UMass Clean Energy Extension, and then to the Department of Energy Resources. If approved, the project will receive a 6-cent per kilowatt hour adder for a 20-year SMART period. You can see I've listed the current base compensation rates for a 1 to 5 megawatt project in National Grid territory or in Eversource territory. These are the 2 larger utilities. There's a 3rd utility in Massachusetts, Unitil, that serves a small region north of Worcester County. And worth highlighting here, 6 cent per kilowatt hour. It's more than 50% of one of the base compensation rates. And about 32 megawatts of project applications have been approved for the ag adder thus far. There's an 80 megawatt carve out in the SMART program. So this slide demonstrates the implications of the 6 cent kilowatt hour adder. Both projects have the same inputs. Project costs are identical. The agricultural adder has been excluded from the cash flow on the right. In this example, I'm assuming a single axis tracker design with a 10-foot leading edge height when the modules are in horizontal. This is a standard requirement to meet the ag adder per the SMART regulations. As you can see in these examples, the break even occurs much later for the project without the incentive. Both of these examples assume a 15-year debt service agreement. And the project developers on the webinar are probably thinking, I would never install a project at 10-foot leading edge height without an incentive to do so. This next slide is a fair comparison for a given parcel under agrivoltaic assumptions versus a traditional array. This compares the cash flow for a 5 megawatt project with a 10-foot leading edge height to a fixed tilt system with a 3-foot leading edge height south facing. The agricultural adder has been excluded from the table on the right, while the racking and labor costs represent traditional install pricing. In addition to losing out on the agricultural adder, this project would be subject to the greenfield subtractor, which is applied against the base compensation rate for any facility sited on open space that falls under Category 2 or Category 3 land use defined by the SMART program. While the break-even duration is similar to the agrivoltaic assumption on the left, the lifetime cash flow of the project is far less. The next lever I wanted to demonstrate was cost savings for lowering the panel edge of an array by 2 feet. This is significant because each foot above the ground, the posts have to go below. So the 2-foot difference is really 4 feet. I was pretty surprised when I ran this in preparation for this webinar because it only produced about a 3.14 cent per watt savings in steel. In talking with some of the subcontractors and installers, the labor pricing was essentially the same because the same equipment had to be rented to install the torque tubes, modules, and braces that far above the ground. So we're aware of some of the added cost to agrivoltaics, included additional steel, added infield labor hours, and long-term O&M. But agrivoltaics can present several areas of cost savings, such as pre-development work going through CONSCOM and Planning Board. In my experience going through both of these meetings, I've had members, when they're taking a vote on projects, they've stated this is the type of solar we want to see in our communities. While we can't quantitatively measure this, having landowners who produce on their fields present during these meetings certainly expedites our review process, and in turn, any civil work or potential redesigns that otherwise might have been required. By working with the landowner and farmer partner, you can prepare the land in advance of construction. During a project built last year, our farmer's annual field operation included planting a cover crop in the fall for overwintering. And then we left it in the field as we started the work in April of last year. And as Jill had mentioned, we received record rainfall beginning about middle to end of June. And we lost one day while other neighboring sites were shut down for multiple days at a time. And I really think the cover crop made all the difference in that scenario. And this is an image of that field with the cover crop reestablishing itself after the posts and all of the infield work had been completed. More so on site preparation, many of the farm fields have existing access roads. We still need to improve these by adding gravel and compacting the surface for emergency access, but we're not clearing the space to add additional access points. And by installing the wiring and the modules at a greater height, we avoid fencing requirements, which are a significant project cost and further aesthetic burden to an already utilitarian view. In a state with an agricultural incentive, there aren't as many existing agrivoltaic arrays as I would have expected, with an incentive going into effect in 2018. I mentioned earlier that 32 megawatts have been awarded for the agricultural adder, but only 4 projects have been energized, and these roughly represent about 3 megawatts AC. The lack of projects is for several reasons, but my biggest lesson learned is that these projects happen because the developer and landowner want them to. Persistence is the key to it. Tapping into REAP funding is a tremendous opportunity right now. There are quarterly funding opportunities, and the total amount of annual funding has increased significantly. While returns could be potentially greater on a different parcel or by installing traditional ground mount array, if we want to see more agrivoltaics, we need to lead by example, and I think the support structures will follow. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much to all of our panelists and presenters today. If you don't all mind coming off of video mute for our Q&A session, we'll go ahead and transition into this. But yeah, this has been a very interesting commentary on economic and financial modeling from all different perspectives within agrivoltaics. We have a good amount of audience questions already popping up, and so I'm excited to start this conversation. I guess first question right off the bat, and maybe I should have shared this with the group at the start as well, but I come from a financial analysis background. I've been a financial analyst for mostly for utility scale renewable energy developers over the last few years. And one challenge I faced that I assume all of you have faced as well is getting good quality information, and especially dealing with information as it changes over time. So I'll open up to the group. Perhaps Dr. Fitzsimmons, we can come to you first, and maybe everybody can comment very briefly about this. I guess emphasis on briefly, since this can be probably a whole webinar in and of itself. But could you share some practices that you use to try to vet information, get good quality information, and confirm that it is good quality information?
That's a really big question. Yeah, I mean, I think, narrowly applying it to the project that Jake and I are working on, our information is terrible. I mean, when we look at I think James probably has a better access to better information right now, but it's really hard right now to design experiments, which is what we try to do, to collect data for this kind of project. If you're talking about farming, it's it takes a long time. We've had so many supply chain constraints with getting these, we're just getting materials to build the arrays. And then we had this terrible season. Every season in agriculture is a terrible season. It just changes every year, like why it's terrible. So it's very hard to get consistent data. The other thing about the project we're working on right now is that, you know, Jake showed this, a series of pictures, which I think are really useful. You know, his company started out doing on an agricultural research farm, right? Most states have an extension service and they have a farm that's like a practice farm, and they can run controlled experiments. They run these controlled experiments on these farms. They can control like everything you can control in an outdoor environment. And you can get pretty good data out of that, but it's really limited in scale. It's limited to that one little microclimate. It's limited to the kind of farmers who are research farmers, right? Which is a particular way of farming. Our project is working on actual arrays on actual farms, which is great in a lot of ways. And from a data perspective, it's terrible because nothing's consistent, right? So we get some really good information about behavior and observations that theoretically we could test in the future. Data quality, not so great. So having said that, there are a lot of sources for really the best data you can get. You know, in our country, we are very blessed to have the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service. I missed a syllable in there, but you guys know what I'm talking about. They collect a lot of data. Do they collect data on agrivoltaics? They do not. Could they in the future? They could. They have some other stuff about renewables that, you know, people are starting to look into. So I don't know. I don't know if I answered your question, but it's a very big question.
Yeah, it's
anyone else?
Yeah, I didn't set you up too well. It's a great answer. Yeah, James, it seems like you have some information you want to share too about that.
Yeah. I think the whole data quality really matters on the question that you're trying to answer. I mean, if you're just trying to do kind of like a screening up front, like I don't think that you need great data. Like everything's kind of a little fuzzy anyways. And so it's really the most of the time that I do these types of analyses, I'm just like, I know I'm wrong. I could be 100 to 200% wrong, but I know that the numbers compared to each other with like a consistent modeling framework are probably going to be close. And so I think that's kind of again, this is like from like the research perspective, like I think that's fine to kind of have more kind of fuzzy data, you know, when you get it, awesome, but it's more when you get, I think, kind of upstream to the, you know, Jake's kind of perspective on like, we're now entering an RFP requirement, you know, basically all this stuff kind of changes overnight. Like you might have access to panels one day, one not the next, you know, you might run out of steel in the area. There's just like a lot of things. And I think one of the things that I have learned over 8 years of trying to generalize this information is that this information cannot be generalized. And so it really depends on, I think, the question that you're trying to answer. And I think just being super transparent about like where the flaws lie. And this is basically based off my best knowledge. Because I mean, developers and farmers are exactly the same. Their competitive advantage comes from their costs. And so why would they share that? And so it's truthfully like, how do you use the information that you can get to answer the question, and then just being truthful when not. That's at least, I guess, kind of a lot of my methodology on that front.
Yeah, I think for me, working with farmers, I try to present what limited research we have. Jill had mentioned, you know, we have the controlled environment led by agronomist Dr. Stephen Herbert at UMass Amherst, but their operations are a lot different. Of course, this is commercial agriculture, so they understand a lot better than I do. Farming is very inconsistent. It's weather dependent. Each year presents its own challenges, and in Massachusetts, we're experiencing drought-like conditions early in a year and then record rainfalls later in the growing season. So the farmer clients that we're working with are somewhat comfortable with the risk that they're potentially taking, that the crop could falter, because under current conditions, it could be faltering anyway. So try to present the best research that we have available, recognizing it has its limitations.
Yeah, if you don't mind, oh, sorry, Austin.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Well, I guess the other thing that I think is really important to realize is that this is a nascent industry, right? This is a nascent idea. And so everything that each of us, you know, we're all doing our best with what we have. I think that a lot of us thought we were going to have data at the end of these projects, but I think what we're finding is that we have refined research questions. And as we move forward and as we refine those research questions and we learn about what worked and what we learned from what didn't work about how we initially set up our research questions, that leads us and others to develop better ones and to develop better methods. And that's kind of how something like this starts inevitably. And as time goes on, we work with each other and we learn from each other and we publish stuff. And hopefully we are able to improve over time. And, as I said, maybe someday USDA will be collecting data on this from their census of farmers. And that would be great.
Yeah, these are all great points, and it's it's a crystal ball thing, right? You're never going to know exactly what weather patterns are going to be like in 20 years or 30 years, and you're never going to know even year to year necessarily what those may be like. And and so what we do with that information is challenging. And like you said, Jill, I think you put it very nicely. That's a great way to help us to lead to prioritize the future questions we go to investigate, future looking. And Jake, I don't know if you can maybe comment on it, but with these variable amounts of information and quality of information that exists in this field, what kinds of things can you do from a modeling perspective to get comfortable maybe with some of these risks, since you're not going to be able to fully mitigate against them?
Ooh, I suppose it's somewhat of the approach of the farmer takes every year, that they're going to try to do their best with the conditions that are provided to them. So I suppose from the modeling perspective, we're not so focused on the crop revenue itself, because how we've structured it, at least right now, most of the projects that we've worked on are leasing. So the farm revenue is just tied directly to the farm. I suppose if it were an operating model or a farmer owner operated model, then we might take that more into consideration, how it's going to perform. But I think for right now, that's not necessarily something that we've totally incorporated to date.
Yeah, it's difficult for sure. And I think it's great that in your slides you pointed to some of the key variables and some of the things that move the needle a little bit more than others, so you can kind of prioritize where to focus maybe some of your efforts on the cost side of things. And these are great conversations. James, I would like to ask you a question from the audience. We have a question that: is there an online database of the different projects under Inspire that list out the solar PV design, the balance of systems, and if there are any bifacial panels, for example, basically project level data for the Inspire program?
The short answer is yes. We have a map on the Inspire website, basically highlighting kind of all those relevant kind of information throughout kind of the United States currently. So I think we have just about 500 sites listed currently. We probably know that that's more, but that represents roughly 10% of the solar project that are in the EIA, or Energy Information Agency database. So that is the first initial kind of perspective. And basically, if you go to the Inspire site, there's just like a map. So yes, that is readily available right now.
Awesome. And James, a similar question about the SAM model, at least, is
Yep.
How do you approach state level incentives, or do you approach
Yep.
state level incentives?
Yeah, so for the financial calculator, that was not something that was kind of incorporated. That's really, there's basically the system advisor model does allow you to change all of those kind of like metrics. It's just when you try to make a generalized tool, it just kind of becomes extremely difficult. So it's something that can easily be changed by the user. There's, basically state level taxes, federal taxes, local incentives, federal incentives, but the user just might have to kind of do some research and kind of enter that in for their specific site. So definitely available, but might be a little bit more sophisticated than just kind of that like initial finance Inspire calculator.
Great, thank you. And one thing, we have a few questions in the chat about NPV, and that came up a few times in the presentation. Maybe Jake, I'll go to you on this, but could you explain what NPV, or net present value, means and why that's an important metric to evaluate while you're modeling?
Yeah, of course, it has a huge impact on the investment tax credit, and agrivoltaics inherently are more expensive, so the net present value or the earlier value, you're receiving a higher ITC than you otherwise would be with a traditional array. So I think that is one area that we look at as an advantage of agrivoltaics compared to traditional solar, being able to kind of take advantage of that. It's not at all a loophole. Of course, it's coming out of a significant cost increase, but we are also able to depreciate that value of the equipment at an accelerated rate as well.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, and yeah, I think net present value, at least when I was doing a lot of modeling, was one of my favorite tools to use, just because it put things into perspective about, it's difficult to evaluate how benefits down the road may, how relevant those may be compared to different decisions you can make today. And so net present value is a great way, I think, to compare those and put those kind of on a level playing field, kind of adjust them to what is their value in today's dollars, and really be able to make these decisions. And like you said, Jake, potentially get some more ITC value out of these decisions with increased costs, and make other decisions based on that. Yeah, and James, we do have a question about NPV. You said, or the SAM outputs you showed in your presentation show that the NPV of a traditional solar installation has the greatest NPV by far, with little difference in quality of sunlight and ground coverage compared to other options. Our panelist here, or excuse me, our participant here is wondering, is there any reason for a for-profit solar developer not to choose a traditional solar installation and make AgPV work within the confines of that setup?
No. From an economics perspective, no. Currently, the most kind of bang for your buck is going to be traditional utility scale solar, just because you make a lot more on PV revenue than you do on farming. I think that's just the pure and simple kind of economic perspective. Having said that, there are so many other things than just making the correct economic decision, such as access to land, stakeholder kind of like inputs into that. Also, just finding a farmer who wants to farm that land. We have a site on the NREL campus that is it is not a farm, it is a garden. And just when panels are 18 inches off the ground, it's super kind of short. It's really difficult to farm. So like there's all of these like kind of perspectives of that, like, can you, what is the minimum kind of requirement kind of change, and basically how does that kind of modify for like the different perspectives? I think one of the things that we're finding is that from the PV developer perspective, it makes sense to put solar and get as much kind of solar production out of that same plot of land as possible, which is why we're seeing the development patterns continue. When you look at it from the farmer perspective, though, if they can diversify their revenue, they can basically get some more kind of money to kind of offset some of the bad years. They can potentially kind of continue farming practices. There could be some way, kind of like revenue sharing and other things. Solar makes sense from the ag perspective in terms of, like, again, purely economic, but not on the developer perspective, which I think is really where, and I think this kind of goes towards the Massachusetts SMART program. Like that's like a classic incentive issue. There is one party that benefits, there's another party that doesn't. So how do you kind of like basically kind of even that out? So no, I think from a purely economic perspective, if I had an acre of land and I wanted to make as much money as possible, I would just put down solar. But there's just so much more that kind of goes into that is like from a non-economic perspective. And I guess I pass it off to Dr. Fitzsimmons if he has anything to add on that.
First of all, you guys just call me Jill. I mean, I'm proud
Sorry.
of myself. Don't get me wrong, but my name is kind of a mess. And anyway, but thank you. I appreciate the recognition. So yeah, I mean, I think your answer is right on, James. I mean, if you're looking from a pure perspective of how do I maximize my revenue from this resource that I have, you should just put it in solar. There's no question. Having said that, I think especially in the eastern part of the country, as a community, as a society, we value agricultural production. And, I think one thing that's kind of important to recognize is that there are all these models, right, of how much what our 2050 goals are for renewable energy production, there are similar goals about how much food production we should have by 2030 or 2050. And it's a trade-off, right? If you use all the land to do it one way, you're not going to get the other thing. So the world, we have these competing interests, right? We want to produce our own food. We want to have renewable energy. Why, there's different people think we should approach this differently. And I think, Jake, you can speak to the fact that there's public pushback, right? So it's not just about necessarily what the farmer wants to do with their land, because as it turns out, from an economics perspective, agricultural land is considered to be a public amenity, even though it's a privately held thing. And because we've subsidized agriculture for so long, it's kind of hard to disabuse people of that notion, right? Especially when you live in a place where we live, where there's a lot of land pressure and a lot of population. So yeah, I think there are a lot of factors that go into that decision. And I think that's where the economic perspective of how does this affect society really starts to come into play.
Yeah, these are great points. When I was doing my financial modeling, frequently we had a saying that all models are wrong. Like, to an extent, all models are wrong. And I think, in some ways, that's also about what we talked about earlier, where certain variables may not pan out how you anticipated they will, and so on. But I think also one element of that is, are all perspectives considered in the model? And some of these models are tools that are intended for very focused purposes, potentially just the solar array or just the agriculture side of things. And it's difficult, but it is also important to think about how to rope in broader concepts like societal benefits or environmental benefits, and how this all plays into the puzzle that is kind of an agrivoltaic solution. So yeah, thank you all for your comments there. Jill, I'll stay with you for a second here as well. I think also the SMART program, having this 6 cent per kilowatt hour adder for agricultural projects that Jake mentioned in his presentation, is a big way to address some of these concerns and be able to provide some of that economic incentive to these developers to do something more with their land than just traditional solar. But it sounds like there are still a pretty small number of agrivoltaic projects in the SMART program so far since 2018. I'm wondering, or our audience members wondering, could you comment on that? And are the regulations overly prescriptive, or are there other reasons for that?
I think actually Jake probably has a better perspective on this from the sort of project by project level than I do. But I will say that from the society perspective, people are not sold on agrivoltaics. There are surveys that have been conducted in this area that show that people think that not everyone, we're actually in the middle of developing a much larger sort of, hopefully more rigorous research project right now to sort of address this. But when people think about where these arrays should be going, a lot of people think they should be going in parking lots. They should be going on top of large warehouses, right? They think that there are other places that should be prioritized, and they think the agricultural adder is not good policy. So I think there's public pushback. People have different ideas about what the priorities should be. And that comes down to the local level. Now, Massachusetts, for people around the country, I am from the Midwest. And when I moved to Massachusetts, I'm going to tell you something. It blew my mind how invested and involved people are in local decision making for businesses. I mean, the way that people take ownership, it's kind of beautiful in some ways, and also kind of a lot in other ways. People really go to meetings, town planning meetings, and really talk about the sort of ins and outs of things that you would really think are sort of minutia. I think it's a culture that is here that is maybe not common in other places in the country. And so I think that's one aspect to sort of take into consideration. A lot of these planning decisions happen on the local level. Towns are 3,000 people, right? So it's a really different sort of mix in the way that decisions are made. But Jake, you can speak more, I think, specifically to these.
Yeah, so I think the original in the original review process, a lot of projects were not accepted or awarded the agricultural adder out of fear of greenwashing. Some bigger developers going right up to the maximum. It first started as 2 megawatts and then was increased to 5 megawatts per project under the SMART program. And I think the original intent through MDAR and DOER is that projects would be, around 500 kWAC and below, and sort of start with crawling before we run. And One of the other challenges as a developer, there have been 5 changes in the Smart Program ASTGU regulations within 6 years now. So consistent changes that we have to adopt and get to. And I will say that, you know, at least in the project in Hadley, for community push, there was no community pushback. I think there was one comment in a town Facebook group, which as a developer, my past is in general contracting construction. If you have one comment in a Facebook group, you're doing really well. And I've had neighbors come out to the site and they've said, oh, this isn't a housing, when we were building the project, oh, this is not a housing, you know, development going in. We are happy that this is, you know, happening in our community. I mentioned what the planning board and ConsCom members have said. And I think with further proof or documentation of it, you know, similarly, there are neighboring farms adjacent to that site. And during the build, all of the neighboring farms come by and sort of, all right, skeptical, that's inherent in their nature. But then to see the actual crop or fruit budding in the fall, it was sort of the aha moment. So I think with more of that, with more good examples, there will be more adoption or acceptance, and also recognizing the levelized cost of energy to go on carports, or like where we are, there's a mall roof that is consistently brought up, but that's just cost prohibitive to install on that. And carports are still significantly more expensive even than agrivoltaics are.
Yeah, thank you both for your perspectives on that. Jake, I'm going to stay with you for a second with this next question as well. But I know from previous conversations we've had, you're starting to look into this idea of raising cattle under solar panels. And sheep grazing has become a pretty common application of agrivoltaics, especially since there are few to no design changes that a lot of developers need to make a compatible array with sheep. But we have a person in the audience here asking if you can comment on how the impact of raising panels to accommodate solar panels affects the economics, and especially interested on if you've seen anything about additional wind damage risk with those elevated panels at that height.
Yeah, so wind damage, we, for all of our projects, we go through a geotechnical analysis test, and that determines, you know, sort of what the steel I-beam reinforcement weight is going to have to be per weight foot. And it depends on what type of beef cattle or cattle you're going to be raising out there. If it's sort of a one season breeder calf, and then it's out of there in the fall, so you're looking at like an 800-pound cow versus something that might be a ranch cattle, I don't know, out there for multiple years and getting up into thousands of pounds. So for beef cattle, we're going through a farm plan right now for a project in Hinsdale, Mass. And we're looking, I mean, we could go probably 8-foot leading edge height because we're using a single axis tracker. It'll dip down to about 6.5 or 6 feet to allow for if there's any sort of, I guess, bucking or the cow gets up. I think that height would be the minimum we would want to go to is sort of 8-foot leading edge height for a single axis tracker.
Gotcha. Thank you for commenting on that. And yeah, James, you want to add something?
Yeah, I think kind of like what we've been hearing anecdotally is that the even just like raising the panel 2 feet in the, you know, from like the previous thing could result in actually a massive amount of steel that is actually needed. So one, for every foot above ground, there's at least 1 foot in the ground generally. So that's right, you know, a 2 feet increase is actually 4 feet of steel. Number two, I think as Jake mentioned, like going to these higher kind of like systems, you might have to upsize the I-beam for kind of the incident loading. So you could almost double your steel on like a 10,000 post site pretty quickly. And that's I think kind of some of the pushback that we're seeing. The other issue is that just kind of installation practices. I think above 6 feet, you have to, depends on the jurisdiction, you have to actually have fall arrest. So it adds a lot of like cost and time. So it's not just like, it's basically one of these things that a small decision like that actually has a ton of impacts that kind of resonate throughout. And it's just being very careful about that, because I think what seems easy on paper, oh, just add a couple feet, is actually could have a lot of implications if you don't kind of sit down and kind of put pencil to paper.
Yeah, it's a great point. Especially sounds like having access to the SMART program adder for ASTGUs is a big way to kind of combat some of those technical difficulties and financial difficulties with that. Thank you both for commenting on that. You know, we have a comment, James, I'll go to you for this one. We have a question that says, how do you basically evaluate different panel technologies and kind of balance the cost that may be, or the increased cost that may be in tandem with something like a bifacial module, and how do you evaluate that additional cost against the generation ability that those panels may have?
Yeah, I think that that's kind of something that's popping up. For the most part, we tend to follow industry trends. And so the fact that I think most of the utility scale solar market has gone to bifacial is for two reasons. One is that the increased generation is justified by the increased cost. I want to say I think the increased cost is between 5 and 10%, and that's roughly the gain. And so really what it is you can get more power on the same amount of land versus like I'm actually making more money. And so it's just because kind of like land access is such a big deal. It's much more of like a land kind of perspective. For the thin film modules, I think that is something that is of huge interest, and in particularly like semi-transparent, other kind of like basically wavelength tuned modules that you can actually allow light to get through the module and basically to the crops while still kind of producing electricity with, I'm going to use quotation marks here, non-beneficial sunlight. But the largest issue with that is, number one, is that they're not available kind of currently on the market at the scale needed to kind of actually kind of do the scale up. Also, a lot of these technologies are not kind of UL listed or underwriters laboratory listed. So you actually cannot get those projects insured. So therefore you cannot sell to the grid. So it's kind of this like it's much more about a market driver and like a land driver than it is about like I want to use this technology for this reason. Like anecdotally, like I'm not gonna lie, I am just stunned at how many of these decisions are based around insurance. Like, can I insure my project? It's 95% of the decisions from like an engineering background. It blew my mind. But I think that's kind of a lot of these decisions kind of come down to that is, can I get insurance? Can I get financing? And no one wants to be the first, second, third, or fourth. Everyone wants to be the fifth. So that's I think kind of just like the reality there.
Yeah, that's a great point. Insurance is a big driver. I've seen projects in my experience get killed because they couldn't get insurance, and it's it is whether you like it or not, I guess something you have to adhere to when you're developing your projects. James, since you're our only Colorado representative here, I'm going to stay with you on this one as well. But we have a participant commenting that there was a personal property tax exemption created for agrivoltaic projects in Colorado that went into effect on January 1st of this year. This provision was written based on the assumption that making agrivoltaic projects exempt from the personal property tax would partially offset the added cost of materials and equipment required for agrivoltaics, which sounds great. But do you think, in your personal opinion, James, that policy will actually make a difference in incentivizing new projects?
I think I'm going to say no comment on that. I haven't looked into it enough, to be honest. So Austin, you probably looked at this more than I have. So I'm going to kick that back to you. We're going to reverse the hats here.
Hey, the turntables, yeah.
Yeah.
So in my experience, especially as doing financial modeling in Colorado, personal property taxes on solar equipment are pretty substantial. If you can qualify, if you're an eligible project for that incentive, then that is certainly a huge impact on your operating expenses. I'll admit that property taxes is not your largest of your operating expenses. That's typically something more around preventative maintenance or vegetative management, stuff like that. But at the same time, property taxes is one of those other very significant kind of next tier costs that you often have on these projects. So it certainly helps. Now, whether it's enough to by itself offset the additional cost your project may have to incur to be an agrivoltaic project, that's kind of a case-by-case analysis. And like we've mentioned and kind of alluded to already, the more steel that you have to put in the ground, the higher you have to go with your racking, which means also the deeper you need to go with your steel post in the ground. It doesn't take a very large increase in height to kind of offset that property tax exemption that you get. Unfortunately, I'm not really able to comment on what that height difference may be, but I imagine within only a few feet or so, you may have kind of broken even on your net present value against that property tax incentive. But still, great to see policies like that exist. Those are very helpful. They still do have an impact. Let's see. We're getting to the point. I'll ask one more question if we can go quick here. But I guess maybe this is for you, James, as well. It's someone says they've read about the importance of low impact development during construction to minimize soil removal and soil compaction. Have you considered any costs in respect to that in terms of either higher labor costs, different installation methods, or are there even potentially cost savings associated with that?
Yeah. I don't think that we've done a good job of kind of categorizing those costs. Just I think that because they're so highly variable, like, how do you assess if something's actually needed to kind of get geotechnical stability versus like just this is just a practice that we just normally do. I think anecdotally we're seeing a lot higher success of vegetation establishment. And in particularly like with like pre-construction seeding, which inherently then kind of like leads you to kind of these like low impact development costs. I think anecdotally I've heard like it's 2 to 3 times more expensive to install vegetation once the panels are up versus not. So even if you put down a bunch of cover crop, you tear up 30% of the site, you're actually still going to save money. And so I think it's been interesting just seeing, like, I think oftentimes I base, my impressions off of what is industry doing currently, and the fact that most large scale solar developers we're talking to are going to pre-construction seeding means that they found some cost savings there. So I can't answer that question qualitatively or quantitatively, but I can, I guess, a little qualitatively. Go
Actually,
Yeah.
in our project, we have soil scientists who have been doing pre and post installation soil testing. So we're going to have some good results. I don't know the timeline that those results are going to be sent out, but I also think it's really important to note that there are some differences when you're talking about field crops versus perennial crops, right? So you're probably not going to take a brand new field, install your arrays, and then plant a whole bunch of, actually, I think some people are doing it with apple trees in Germany, but just saying, most farmers are not going to be doing that. So that's a different question, and especially for perennial crops that have a root system that is very hard to avoid, like a cranberry. There have been some concerns about impact on the actual plants and on the root systems of the plants, and I do think we're going to get some results based on that, hopefully pretty soon. So we don't have the answers now, but we're trying.
Well, hey, that's good news to know that's on the horizon. But with that, unfortunately, we are at time here, so I do need to wrap this up. Thank you all so much for attending today. Thank you to our panelists, Jill, James, and Jake. Thank you so much for attending and for your presentations. They were super thoughtful, and I think this discussion was very, very helpful. Hopefully leads to some real impact in the world. So yeah, thank you again to all of you. If you would like to learn more about this and see this recording, which we'll post to our website in about a week or so, please go to coagrivoltaic.org. You also would appreciate it greatly if you'd consider donating on that website so we can continue doing what we do. But thank you again for your time. For those of you who I didn't get a chance to answer your questions, if you'd like to send an email to info@coagrivoltaic.org, we can see what we can do about getting your questions answered via email. But thank you again, everybody, for your time today, and hope you have a good rest of your day or a good rest of your evening or morning, wherever you're joining us from.
Thanks.